Dakota Territory, December 1887. The wind howled like a starving coyote through Dustwater Hollow, dragging winter across the valley as the sun dipped low, and a girl was thrown to the mud outside an old barn, where the past had been buried, but not forgotten. Let me tell you what happened one bitter winter in Dakota Territory, when the sky hung low like a burdened ceiling, and the cold bit so hard it could crack bone. Folks in these parts still whisper about that day, the way stories drift like smoke around a fire. Not about the girl, though she deserved the telling, but about the man who hadn't spoken in 10 years, until he said one sentence that changed everything. Dustwater Hollow wasn't much to look at even in the good months, but that year it was near desolate. The winds tunneled through the canyons, dragging dust and frost like ghosts through the narrow main road. The sun rarely made it past the thick wool of clouds, and when it did, it barely warmed the black mud that never dried. The town's wooden buildings hunched against the wind, weather-beaten and sullen, their shutters rattling like dry bones. Just past the last crooked fence stood an old barn with a sagging roof and a split-rail fence, abandoned to most eyes, but still pulsing with the quiet breath of life. They threw the girl in the mud just before that barn. Lena May was barely 17, barefoot and trembling, wrapped in a shawl too thin for fall, let alone this cutting winter. Her skin was pale from hunger, lips cracked and blue. She had her mother's hair, dark and wild, and her father's stubborn chin. Not that anyone cared to remember either of them kindly. The sheriff didn't show up, not even to fake concern. It was the mayor's wife who pointed her finger first, called her a thief loud enough for the whole town to hear. She took bread off my windowsill. I saw it with my own eyes. Lena didn't speak. She couldn't. Not because she was guilty, but because the wind had frozen every word in her throat. Her mother had died 3 nights ago, fever and no medicine, not a soul who came knocking. They buried her without a name marker, behind the church where the frost couldn't touch the earth deep enough. Lena had nowhere to sleep, nowhere to beg. She'd wandered, hollow-eyed and desperate, maybe too close to something that wasn't hers. That was all it took. 2 boys dragged her through the street like a sack of feed, laughter echoing off the saloon walls. Her legs scraped against broken rocks. Her hands reached back, as if still searching for her mother's hand. They dumped her at the barn gate, where the slush pooled thick and black. Her shawl slipped down. Her knees sank. She's cursed like her mama was. Someone whispered behind a gloved hand. Nothing but orphan trash, said another, a woman with a child in her arms, who turned the boy's face away like Lena's hunger might spread through his eyes. Nobody offered a hand. In Dustwater Hollow, kindness was buried deeper than gold. The town wasn't always so cruel, they said, but ever since Jed Colburn and his gang started bleeding the county dry, from the mines, the stage routes, even the sheriff's office, people got quieter. Fear has a way of eating the part of you that remembers how to help someone else. Lena was just one more name they didn't want to carry. But someone was watching. Behind the warped planks of the barn stood a man few remembered clearly. Harlan Briggs. He hadn't spoken to anyone in over a decade. Scarred down his right cheek, limp in his walk, eyes like winter steel. Folks called him Mad Harlan when they dared call him anything at all. Some said he'd lost his mind when his wife and little girl died. Others swore he was a killer who turned his back on justice. Nobody asked him to explain, and he never volunteered. But he saw her. She didn't cry, that girl in the mud. Didn't beg. Just wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the dirt, too proud to shiver where they could see it. Harlan pushed open the barn door with a low groan. Every head on the street turned. The wind stopped like it wanted to listen. He was tall, shoulders broad beneath a worn buffalo hide coat, boots stiff with old mud, the kind of man carved from something harder than time. He walked straight toward Lena, past the mayor's wife, past the whispers and the sideways glances. His boots squelched in the slush as he knelt beside her. Lena didn't look up, not until she felt the weight of wool draped across her shoulders. The coat was heavy, warm, smelling of smoke and cedar. It swallowed her frame. And then she heard him speak. Words cracked with rust and years of silence. "Get up, girl. You'll sleep in my warm bed now." A gasp swept the street like a sudden wind. He said it plainly, not kind, Not cruel, just final. Then he slipped one arm beneath her knees, the other behind her back, and stood slow, stiff from old injuries, but strong still. He didn't glance at the others. Didn't care how they stared like ghosts witnessing a resurrection. Lena's fingers clenched the coat. For the first time in days, her eyes widened, not from fear, but disbelief. He carried her past the barn door, into the dark. The town stood still. Not one voice rose. No one moved. It was as if something sacred had just walked by, and none of them had the right to speak its name. That night, no one knocked on Harlan Briggs' door. No one dared. And though the wind howled through Dustwater Hollow long into the dark, inside that old barn-turn cabin, the fire never went out. Morning came slow to the cabin. Pale light sifted through the warp-glass panes, catching on the floating dust and curling smoke from the hearth. Lena stirred under thick wool blankets, her skin still sore from the cold, but no longer hollowed by it. The air was warm, and for a moment she didn't move, afraid it was a dream that might scatter if she breathed too hard. The smell of something frying on a cast-iron pan reached her. Eggs, maybe, or cornmeal. She blinked and turned her head. Harlan stood near the fire, silent as always, one hand turning the skillet, the other steadying a tin cup of coffee. The old man barely glanced her way, but he slid a plate onto the table and nodded once. Eat. It was the second time he'd spoken to her. She sat up slowly. The bed was clean, frame rough-hewn but sturdy. There was a rug beneath her feet, a chip basin with fresh water by the door, and stacked firewood beside the stone hearth. Everything was worn, functional, nothing wasted. The kind of place built by hands that didn't need anyone else. She ate with quiet desperation, trying not to seem starved. Harlan didn't look at her. He went outside after a few minutes, returning with hay on his boots and steam rising from his coat. She heard horses snorting, felt the chill creep in for a second as the door opened, then closed. That was how the days began. He never asked for anything, just pointed. At the saddle that needed mending, the tack to oil, the feed buckets. Lena watched, learned, did more each morning. When she stitched a tear in one of his old shirts, he said nothing, but she caught the way he wore it the next day. When she made stew that didn't burn, he scraped the pot clean. The land stretched wide around the cabin, brown grass, brittle fences, a creek half frozen and coughing under its thin skin of ice. The barn stood tall and crooked, horses inside gentle and strong. There was no one else for miles, no gossip, no shame, just wind and work. Lena began to change. She grew stronger from the lifting, steadier from the quiet. She stopped flinching when doors opened. Her cheeks filled out. Her hands grew calloused. At night, they sat near the fire, him carving bits of wood into shapes he never explained, her reading from the one book she found on the shelf, a Bible missing the last 20 pages. Still, she wondered about the scars on his knuckles, the way he looked east, sometimes like waiting for something to catch up. He never told stories, but he had the look of a man who held entire wars behind his teeth. Then one rainy afternoon, when she was sweeping near the bedroom, she noticed the trunk, not large, but heavy-looking, tucked under his bed. She knelt, lifted the edge of a blanket, and paused. It was painted a deep red, iron corners rusted but intact. 3 initials burned into the wood, HJB. She reached toward it, but the door creaked open behind her. "Don't," Harlan said. His voice was quiet, even, but her hand froze midair like a struck chord. "Never open that chest. Never ask what's inside." She nodded. He didn't explain, and she didn't ask again. But the question festered. The weather turned cruel by midwinter. Snow fell fast and wet. Winds howled through the gaps in the wood like wolves in mourning. The ranch was blanketed in white, and the silence became dense, weighted. Then came the hooves. 6 riders, black coats, rifles, laughter like snakes. Their leader wore an old Union officer's coat, brass buttons still polished. His face was lean, angular, too clean for the trail. His name was Jed Colburn. He dismounted first, boots crunching snow as he strode toward the cabin. The others hung back, guns loose at their hips. Harlan stepped out before they could knock. "Well, I'll be damned," Jed smirked. "Didn't think the ghost still walked." Harlan said nothing. Come now, don't be rude. We're just here for a chat. Jed smiled with all his teeth. Nice little place you got here. Shame if it caught fire in this cold. Lena watched from behind the window, her breath fogging the glass. The way Harlan's hands never moved from his sides, but his eyes, hard as flint, never blinked. You got land, Jed continued. Good land. Word is you've got no kin, no will, no one who'd miss this place if it vanished. Still no reply. Jed's voice sharpened. Mayor Trill's drawing up new town lines. Progress. Roads. Taxes. You understand. Harlan lifted his chin slightly. No sale. Jed narrowed his eyes. You sure about that? The door shut in his face. Lena exhaled only after the sound of hooves faded. Harlan didn't say a word, just went to the fire and sat like nothing had happened. But she saw him oiling the rifle that night. He did it with precision, habit, like muscle memory, not necessity. And the way he stared into the flames, like seeing something far away. She tried to go to the sheriff the next morning, riding into town with her hair tucked under a wool cap. The sheriff didn't even look up when she stepped into his office, just leaned back in his chair and waved her off. You best stay on the old man's good side, he muttered, or your kind'll find colder places than the street this time. On the ride back, Lena's hands clenched the reins hard enough to go white. The next day, the outlaws came again. This time, Jed wasn't laughing. We warned you. One of them sneered. Lena didn't wait for Harlan. She stepped out first, holding the long rifle he'd left leaning near the door. It felt heavier than it should have. She aimed at the man closest, hands shaking. You're not taking this land. The man chuckled. Look at that. The girl thinks she's a ranger. He slapped the barrel aside hard. She fell backward, hit the snow with a sharp gasp. Jed walked up to her, crouched. Tell your old man next time. We burn it down. Then they were gone again. That night, when the wind screamed louder than ever, she couldn't sleep. She lit a candle, crept to Harlan's room, and pulled the red chest free. The lock gave with a soft clack. Inside, the past breathed. A marshal's badge, dull but intact. War medals and faded velvet. A pistol, gleaming, maintained like it had never left his hand. Folded letters, never sent, addressed to a wife and daughter both gone. And then wanted posters. Jed Colburn. Murder, robbery, arson. One name again and again across the faces of his gang. Lena sat frozen, the truth thick in her throat. Harlan Briggs had once been a U.S. Marshal. He hadn't vanished. He disappeared on purpose. After Jed's men murdered his family and escaped the noose, Harlan had buried the badge and vanished into dust. But now she knew, and the badge still gleamed. The wind howled through the rafters that night, rattling the windows with a wildness that felt like prophecy. Lena stood in the doorway of the small room where Harlan sat sharpening his knife in the flicker of firelight. His coat hung over the chair, badge lying dull on the table beside it. The rifle leaned against the wall, silent and waiting. She stepped closer, fists clenched at her sides. Why did you stop being who you were? He didn't look up. The rasp of the whetstone against steel was the only answer for a while. Then he said, almost a whisper, because justice didn't bring them back. You think hiding brought peace instead? His shoulders tensed. I chased men like Jed Colburn for 20 years. Thought I was doing right. But when it came down to it, the law turned its back. Let them walk. My wife, my daughter, they paid the price. Lena's voice cracked, but she held her ground. Then don't do it for them. Do it for now. You saved me. Now save others who can't stand like I can. He looked at her then, really looked. Her eyes no longer held the hollow ache of survival. They burned with purpose. He set the blade aside. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow we finish it. At dawn, the cabin glowed with a quiet heat. Harlan stood by the mirror, lathering his jaw with shaking fingers, scraping away the beard he'd worn like armor for a decade. When he finished, his face looked younger and harder at once. He pulled on his coat, dusted the badge off with a careful thumb, and pinned it to his chest. He showed Lena how to hold the rifle, not just lift it, but aim with breath, brace with shoulder, shoot with intent. Her hand shook at first, but steadied with each shot. Together, they rigged tripwires, loaded traps, nailed boards into windows, stacked extra cartridges beside the hearth. Then they waited. The sun bled over the hills in slow drips of gold. By the time the hooves thundered in, the ranch looked asleep under snow. 6 riders again. Jed at the front, smug under his Union coat, expecting surrender. He never saw the first trap. The moment he stepped past the fence post, a shotgun blast erupted from the side rail, one of Harlan's old rigs, a rope-triggered boom that scattered 2 men off their horses. Chaos followed. Gunfire cracked. Horses screamed. One outlaw fell in the snow, clutching his thigh. Lena's bullet had found its mark. From the barn, Harlan strode out slow, steady, rifle over his shoulder, a sidearm at his hip. He fired once, clean and fast. Another outlaw dropped behind the hay bales. Jed shouted orders, eyes scanning wildly. This wasn't what he'd come for. He's got traps. Pull back. But it was too late. Lena moved between fence and porch like she'd been born there, reloading with speed, eyes sharp. A shot grazed her shoulder. She bit down a cry, crouched, and returned fire. The man who hit her fell sideways with a thud, unmoving. Harlan stepped into the open, gun raised. Colburn. Jed turned, saw him, froze. You remember my name? Harlan called. Marshall Harlan Briggs. You murdered my family. You thought time would bury me, too. Jed laughed, shaky. You're just another broken man with a badge that don't mean nothing out here. Harlan dropped the rifle. I'm not hiding behind iron today. He walked forward. Jed drew, but Harlan was faster. The gun flew from Jed's hand, skidding across the snow. What followed wasn't clean. They collided like freight wagons, fist slamming bone, breath fogging between curses and groans. Jed drove his knee into Harlan's gut, but Harlan came back with a hook that split Jed's lip. Snow kicked up around them. Years of silence and grief poured out through fists. Lena screamed from the porch but didn't move. This wasn't hers to stop. Jed went for his knife. Harlan caught his wrist, twisted, shoved him down. He stood over him, snow and blood on his coat, breathing hard. Jed's lip curled. Do it, Marshall. But Harlan didn't move. Behind him, Lena stepped forward, rifle in her arms. Don't, she whispered. Harlan looked at her, then back to the man who'd taken everything. He pulled out a pair of shackles from his coat pocket, old cold iron, and clamped them on Jed's wrists. You'll hang the right way, he said, in front of the people you crushed. By noon it was done. The outlaws who lived were bound and slung over horses. Jed rode tied to his own saddle, bleeding but alive. They left Dustwater Hollow in chains. The news spread faster than the thaw. Mayor Trill vanished 2 nights later. His office burned mysteriously. The sheriff left a resignation note and never returned. The county sent a new circuit judge, and Harlan, for a time, wore the badge again. He stood straighter, face open more often, not with smiles, but with presence. People nodded at him in the street. They came to his door now, not out of fear, but respect. Lena didn't need to stay, but she did. She took over the ranch chores, rode into town without flinching, bought supplies with money she'd earned. Her scar from that first fight healed into a thin silver ribbon. She wore it like a stripe of courage. In time, folks whispered her name too. They say she came from the mud, they'd say, but rose into legend beside the quiet man who once swore he'd never raise a gun again. Out in Dustwater Hollow, Justice wears old boots and rides with the ghosts.